Hello everybody, this is lesson 6 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 131 to 150 of chapter 1 International Trade. In this lesson we will discuss how the implementation of quantitative restrictions affect the welfare of consumers and producers of a country. Beside import tariffs, quantitative restrictions, also called import quotas, still play a quite important role in practical trade policy. However, the World Trade Organization is proposing for decades now to transform quantitative restrictions in equivalent import tariffs, because import tariffs can be reduced more easily. It is therefore difficult to find examples for quantitative restrictions on the current TARIC database of the European Union. Nevertheless, we will analyze the impact of quantitative restrictions in the following. We start again with the situation with free trade in the case of a small country, such that the world market price, this line here, is given. The difference between the domestic production level, given here, and the domestic consumption level, given here, is covered by imports from the world market. So the length of this bracket here represents the imports under free trade. As before, the area above the world market price and below the demand curve represents consumer surplus. The area below the world market price and above the supply curve represents producer surplus. Now let's assume that an import quota equal to the length of this bracket is implemented by the government. As we can observe, the import quota is smaller than the imports under free trade. Consequently, it will reduce the import level after the implementation of the import quota. Consequence of the import quota is now a change of the shape of the supply curve. The supply curve in general informs about the lowest price at which supply quantities are available on the market. So the new supply curve follows first the domestic supply curve along this line segment here, as long as domestic supply quantities are produced cheaper as the world market price. Once domestic production costs exceed the world market price, starting with this intersection point here, the new supply curve follows first the world market price until the import quota is completely exhausted. This is the case in this point here, as we can easily see if we shift the bracket with the import quota in this position. So starting with this point, consumers have to rely on domestic production if they want to consume more of this good. So we have to shift the domestic supply curve parallelly into this position. Now the new resulting supply curve looks like this green curve here. It has a kink where the world market price is hit we exhaust the import quota and then we start production again at home. Now, the resulting price level after the introduction of the quantitative restriction is given by the intersection point of the new green supply curve and the domestic demand curve here. So we can now recognize that the new resulting price is lower than the autarky price, which would be this price level here, but higher as the world market price. Next we can turn to the question what kind of welfare effects the introduction of the import quota has. Because of the higher price level, domestic consumption falls to a lower level, from this position to this position. Domestic production equals now domestic consumption, this amount here, minus the import quota. So it equals this line segment here plus this line segment here. This is equal to the import quota, the part of domestic consumption which is satisfied by imports from the world market. Domestic production now equals domestic consumption minus the imports. We find the consumer surplus again as the area below the demand curve and above the new equilibrium price level. So it is equal now to the area A. This is the new consumer surplus after the introduction of the import quota. The producer surplus is now again given by the areas below the new market equilibrium price and above the supply curve, which measures the marginal costs of producers. So it equals these two surfaces, B and G, and this triangle here, D. This is the producer surplus after the introduction of the import quota. We assume now that the government auctions the import quota to private import companies in terms of licenses. The maximum price such an import company is willing to pay for such a license is the difference between the world market price at which they can buy if they have a license and the domestic equilibrium price at which they can sell. So this red line segment here tells us the value of an import license for 1 unit of this good for a private import company. If you multiply this value of an import license with the number of goods that can be imported with the help of the quota, which is equal to this red line segment here, we receive the maximum revenue a government can reach by auctioning these quotas to private import companies. And this income is then represented by the surface of this rectangular area here, which we call C. This is government income from the introduction of the import quota if the import quota is auctioned to private import companies in the way just described. The areas E and F, which had been part of consumer surplus before was this large triangle here, so A plus B plus C plus D plus E and F. Now E and F belong to nobody. As a result, E and F must be the welfare loss caused by the import quota. We can check this result with the help of this table and analyze how the imposition of an import quota changes the distribution of surplus among consumers, producers, and the government. The second column here tells us the distribution of surpluses before the import quota was implemented. The third column tells us the distribution of surpluses after the import quota is implemented, and the fourth column here tells us the change. Let's have a look at the second column. So consumer surplus is equal to this large triangle here, A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. Consumer surplus is equal to G, this area here. The government has no income since the import quota is not yet introduced. So total surplus is this area here. A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G. After the import quota, the domestic price rises to this level. Consumer surplus is now equal to the area A only. So consumers lose B, C, D, E and F. Therefore they appear here in the last column with a negative sign. Producer surplus after the introduction of the quota is somewhat higher. Additionally to the area G, they receive the area B and D. So here in the column where we measure the change, these areas have a positive sign. It's net increase of surplus for producers. The government auctions the licenses, receives therefore a government revenue equal to C. This is also measured in the last column with a positive sign. So if we now subtract the losses and gains of all agents, consumer, producer and the government, we find that the areas E and F, which are lost by the consumers, are not redistributed in any way to producers or the government, so the areas E and F are a net welfare loss from the introduction of the import quota. On the following slides you find an alternative way to analyze the welfare consequences from the introduction of an import quota. This may help you to deepen your understanding of the analysis. However, as you will see, the final results are of course the same. So much for this lesson. In the next lesson we will discuss various policy doctrines, how to make use of the possibilities trade policy offers.